I mean, only I can remind everyone to mute yourself so that we don't have any feedback. That would be brilliant.
Yeah, also, I don't think I'll have access to the chat as I'm presenting because it gets a full screen PowerPoint. But any questions you may have, feel free to ask them. Yeah, no problem. Cool. What do you think, Lidia? Should we start? Or do you want
shall we?
Yeah,
let's start. So thank you very much for joining us today, and special thanks to Pablo Romero-Fresco, who has very kindly agreed to giving this talk on accessible filmmaking and creative media accessibility in the Center for Visual Cultures. I'm going to just give a little introduction to Pablo's work. Pablo Romero-Fresco is honorary professor of translation and filmmaking at the University of Roehampton and Ramón y Cajal grant holder at Universidad de Vigo, Spain. He is the author of Subtitling through Speech Recognition, Respeaking, and Accessible Filmmaking, Integrating Translation and Accessibility into the Filmmaking Process, both are published by Routledge. He is a member of the research group Transmedia Catalonia, for which he coordinated the subtitling of the EU-funded project VTV for All. And last but not least, Pablo is also a filmmaker. His first documentary, Joining the Dots, about blindness and audio description, was used by Netflix as well as schools around Europe to raise awareness about audio description. His most recent film is Donde se acaba la memoria, When Memory Ends, about Ian Gibson, the historian and Hispanist biographer of Lorca, Buñuel, and Dalí. And well, this talk is recorded, so if you don't want to be seen, please put your camera off. And if you have any question, please put them in the chat as we go along. We'll have a few minutes of Q&A at the end, and that's all from me. Pablo, thank you very much, and I hand it to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to say that I won't be able to see anybody because I've got the full screen presentation, but any questions, I'm happy to take them as I go along as well. Lidia, are you being able to see my presentation at the moment?
Yes, we can see it.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'll run through some aspects to do with accessible filmmaking and creative media access today. And these are some of the contents we're looking at today, which is basically an explanation of what accessible filmmaking is, this project we've been working on for the past 7-8 years, and how it has led to the idea of creative media accessibility. But one thing that is important here, I understand creative media media accessibility as encompassing also translation. So it's not just focusing on how to make films and audiovisual material accessible to everyone, including deaf and blind viewers, users, but also including dubbing and interlingual subtitling. We'll talk about that. So if we focus on accessible filmmaking, the very reason why we started looking into this was this divorce between filmmaking on the one hand, and then translation and accessibility on the other. And the fact that I come from translation and accessibility rather than from the making of. And we've always been so detached from the creative process, so detached, so much so that, well, I'll just give you some data, but if you look at the top grossing films in the first 17 years of the 21st century, and even the Best Picture Oscar winners, we know that actually over 50% of the income of the money they earn comes from the translated or accessible versions. And when you wonder, how much is spent on translation and accessibility, is just 0.01 or 0.1% of the budget. So my side of things, those of us who are involved in translation and accessibility, we give a lot of the revenue is down to us, but very, very little is spent on translation. So we are very invisible in terms of, especially with regard to the importance that the translation and the accessible versions have on those films. So this is something that should give us some leeway to be able to modify, to change things here. There is a gap. No wonder there is a gap between the filmmaker, the translator, and the viewers of the foreign versions and the viewers of the accessible versions. My idea is that I haven't met a great deal of filmmakers who really having in mind a viewer of a foreign version of the film. And this is not to say that there aren't any, but it's not so common. So we want to bring this together and to close this triangle to some extent, because at the moment it's creating issues as well with translators working in very little amount of time. You may be asked to translate a film maybe in 1 or 2 days for £200. No contact with the creative team. It's not ideal. So what do we propose is very simple. Just considering translation and accessibility. This is AFM accessible filmmaking, basically, in a nutshell, would be considering translation and accessibility during the production of audiovisual media. And we do that by promoting the collaboration between the creative team and the translators. And this is important. We want to provide access to all. So that means those who don't have access because they don't know the language, or those who don't have access because they don't have access to the audio or to the images. Yeah, so this is for people with and without disabilities. Okay, so now the fact that we are dealing with media accessibility for all, it's already out there in certain guidelines. We've been working on these United Nations guidelines on subtitles, which are supposed to be subtitles for the deaf, and yet when you look into them, they say subtitles for those who cannot hear or understand the content. Yeah, so that means including those watching a film in a non-native language. My point here is that accessibility and translation are conflating in a way. So when we talk about media accessibility, we're almost already referring to anybody who does not have access to the original version of a film or a theatre play or an opera. This is how things seem to be moving in our field, not least because we realize that a lot of the subtitles that are same language subtitles, for example, English subtitles for an English film, well, 80% of people who use subtitles are not actually deaf or hard of hearing, because, for example, 85% of the video content on Facebook is watched without sound. So even if the subtitles are in the same language of the audio, they're still used by a lot of people who just don't want to or cannot play the sound. So subtitles are everywhere basically these days, everywhere. Okay, now if we establish that, so can we bring together the making and the translation of it, and do we understand that then media accessibility concerns us all in a way, then I've got two questions that are important for me for today, which would be, are filmmakers really making films for all, or do they bear in mind, are they considering all this wide audience, and are we all watching the same film? I know the answer to the second one is no, because we're all different, but to what extent are we watching a different film and why? So I wanted to provide some answers to those questions and then discuss with you. Let's focus on subtitling because it's quite a common media accessibility modality or translation modality. Now, I'd like to focus on the impact that subtitles have on how we receive the film. But for that, let's focus quickly on, let's just say, how do we watch an original film from a physical point of view, and how do we watch a subtitle film? Original film. We've done loads of eye tracking studies on this, and we've, along with many other scholars, there's a consensus that we have voluntary eye movements and involuntary eye movements. What are voluntary eye movements? Well, we take on tasks when we watch a film or a painting, or so we have this painting here, and we can watch it maybe like this. These are about 5 to 10 people who have watched this painting, and we can see how they've traveled around the painting. But maybe if somebody asks, yeah, could you tell me what the material circumstances are of these people? Then we focus on a different thing. We focus on their clothes. And if we say, could you tell what the relationship between them is? Then it changes. Yeah, we focus on the way they look at one another. It's an interesting painting where actually the visitor is identified by the boy, but not by the girl. So probably we're talking about someone who left after he was born, before she was born. But anyway, the idea here being that we watched things differently depending on the tasks that we take on. That's voluntary, but there's a lot of involuntary eye movements. our illusion of volition. We think that we know what we're looking at, but to a great degree, it's controlled by the filmmakers as well. There are certain elements, certain phenomena, if you like. We can't go into detail today, but for example, there is something that Tim Smith in London has found to be, and he's identified it as attentional synchrony. I'm going to show you an example. Lydia, if you could verify, if you can confirm that you can see and hear this video, that would be great.
Yes, we can see it.
I can't hear it yet, so don't worry. I think it's just an issue of. Oh dear. Yeah. Can you hear it?
We can hear it. Yes, thank you.
Brilliant. So what we're seeing here is, I think it was 20 people watching this film. An eye tracking machine, what it does is it gives us the fixations. That is, the moments in which we stop to look at certain elements, and therefore what we are seeing. Yeah, I mean, I'm simplifying it, but. And these are 20 people watching this. Aha! I know you want me. Now, I'd just like you to focus on what's being seen here. There's a convergence, there's a homogeneous pattern in the sense that most people are converging on, obviously, the main Puss in Boots here, right? So we see that this is the movement, the composition created by the filmmakers that are drawing our attention there. It's attentional synchrony, basically. All of us looking there, which is not. And by the way, we have learned with research that, okay, yes, we do have peripheral vision, but we can get very little from peripheral vision, which means that at any given time, we are focusing on only a 3% of the screen. Now, this is not great news for whoever is in charge of the art direction and looking at all this background and everything, but it's not to say that that's not important, because if it wasn't there, we would probably be focusing on it. But things change when we have a different shot here. Here, with a different shot, then we have more people, and then our attention is dispersed. Some people are looking at the door, the cat, the other cat, the women. So it's obviously different depending on the shots. Yeah. Now my question is, this is how we watch original film. We may be focusing on the main character, eyes and mouth. Then when we have several people, our attention is distributed. But what happens when we watch a subtitled film? Do we watch it in the same way? What changes really there? And we know that a lot of things change, and I'm interested in what we miss by looking at those subtitles as well. So normally there is a tidy pattern. We'd like to think of it as a tidy pattern, which would be this one. So a triangle is the journey that we normally take. I don't know if we'll be able to hear. Yeah.
Group settings.
There.
Yes, we can hear it.
Students and employees alike are impeded by a lack of access to spoken information in group settings. Deaf students.
So if you were able to hear and see, right, Lydia?
Yes, we
Thank you.
could hear it.
So normally we read a subtitle, and these are some of the principles that we've learned about. Text draws our attention much more than images on screen. As soon as we have text, our eyes are drawn to that text. Sometimes, regardless of whether we understand the language or not, we still look at the subtitles. Once we read it as fast as we can, we are in a hurry to go up into the screen and look at the main features, which are always going to be people, eyes, mouth, right? But in the same way that when there are no subtitles, we are free to explore around the screen. The same does not normally happen with subtitles, because we are a little bit afraid that since we have lost or wasted some time looking at the subtitle, we won't have time to look too much. So we focus on the basics for longer, and we don't explore the screen so much. So there's a different pattern there in the way we're watching the film. There's a lot of things here that I can't cover now, but these are some of the principles that we have when we watch a subtitled film. I'd like to focus on this one because it's particularly perhaps particularly, I don't know, interesting for me. That is those moments in which, because we are looking at the subtitle, we're missing the images completely. And those are the ones that when we work in an accessible filmmaking way with the filmmakers, we draw attention to them and we say, well, in these shots, as you have them now, people may not be able to watch the film at all. So an example would be, let's just say, let's look at this kind of real life scenario from the BBC. We have this famous kind of weather presenter, and this is what happened. You may know this already.
Now we'll have the weather forecast in a minute, and of course it'll be 100% accurate and provide all the detail you could possibly want. I've just seen Thomas Schaffenacker preparing for it, so I'm not in touch.
Ah!
Every now and then there's always one mistake. That was it.
Now this is obviously very unfortunate, and what we see is that Thomas Schaffenacker, by raising his hand, then causes this. Now, if that was a scripted scene from a film, and I am the original viewer, I'm an original viewer of the original version, I have no problem in listening to the presenters and watching them, seeing how this presenter raises his finger, and then he puts his finger in his mouth, as in concealing, hiding what he's done. Now, if I was to watch the subtitle version of this, I have a problem because I'm subtitling it. As you know, my eyes are drawn. I mean, as a viewer of this version, I'm reading the subtitle first, and it takes me between 1 and 2 seconds to read this. When I look up, that is, when I finish reading the subtitle and I look up, all I can see is Thomas Schaffenacker with his hand in his mouth, trying to cover and conceal something that he has done, but that I haven't seen. So, in other words, the same scene is seen or not seen, depending on whether I'm watching the subtitle version of it. Or if you want to generalize this for a filmmaker, I would say, if you have an important visual element opening a scene and there is dialogue, which therefore will have to be subtitled, maybe half of your audience around the world, those who will be watching the scene with subtitles, will miss the images and will therefore miss the whole point of the scene. I don't know if I'm making myself understood, but this is the idea, and there's very I haven't come across film schools where this is taught, you know, because it's not a consideration that is normally had. So this is something that we need to normally convey to filmmakers and talk about it with them and review the films. There's loads of other elements that I could tell you about, but I'm going to show you another one which is maybe particularly visual, which is this one. A short film that I made about a blind friend of mine and with a friend of mine. And I had an issue where I'll just show you very quickly. The image is very poor because what I did is I run.
I'm seeing somebody put my.
What I'm showing you here is the conflated eyesight of the conflated kind of eye movements of 15 people watching the film. Here it is, orange, without subtitles, and 15 people here in blue watching the film with subtitles. I wanted to put them together to see whether we can spot that difference, right? And have a look at this shot where I am with Trevor. Here it is. I'm with Trevor, and I'm talking to him. And in this scene, what we can hear is his narration. But of course, that is subtitled for those who are watching the film in Spanish. Yeah. Now, could you please have a look at the difference in how this shot is being, this scene actually is being seen by the people who watch the original version with no subtitles in orange, and those who watch the scene with subtitles. That's the blue dot.
No, I went to bed one night with a massive headache. Woke up the next morning, terrible pain. So I was taken to Charing Cross. From there, I was taken across to St George's.
Yeah. What I did is, okay, you can see how the blue dot, those who are watching the subtitles, read the subtitle, looked up to Trevor. Now they're going to be looking down at the subtitle again. As a filmmaker and editor, what I did is I cut to Trevor's walking stick. And that was my mistake, because see what happens with the blue dot.
And the guy said, look, ever so sorry, he said, but you've gone blind in your right eye.
You realize that the blue dot only had time to actually look at the subtitle, but they didn't have time to look at the image at all. Why is that? Because I introduced a quick shot with over dialogue and narration, and that works for the original viewers, but it doesn't work for the viewers of the subtitle version. I then ran an experiment with eye tracking, and I realized that about 20% of the shots that I had in the film were simply not being seen by my viewers of the subtitle version. So that makes you think, doesn't it? Are we watching the same film, or if we are, maybe we're watching it so differently that we might as well be watching different films. There's something about typos. Yeah, there we go. There's something about this that didn't feel quite right, and it was just that I was not considering the viewers of anything other than the original version. And I wonder whether this is something that's happening more in a more general way as well. So what do we do here? First, we impress upon creators of any kind the idea of the global film or the global work, which is, okay, so let's think about not just the original and the subtitle version, but those versions that are going to be provided for deaf people and blind people with subtitles, or with audio narration, audio description for blind people. And let's be in charge of that. Let's keep an eye, let's supervise it, right? And we do this through the figure of the director of accessibility or translation. Somebody who's a link between the filmmaker and the viewers, or even the very different translators. If the film is going to be translated into many languages, there's one person who does the liaison with the filmmaker. So how do we do this? Well, there's a lot of awareness raising that we need to do amongst, and this has been hard, but film festivals, film schools, and we've talked to Netflix, for example, as well, because they were interested in this. So I went to their headquarters in Hollywood, and we trained them on this, and then they came up with different figures, professional figures, the creative dubbing supervisor, for example. And it's interesting because now they have as a name to preserve the original creative intent of our filmmakers, identify challenges, such as the ones we have identified maybe, to work with content creators, and look at this, to develop creative approaches. And that was interesting because as we keep working with filmmakers, we realize that then, obviously, as creative people that they are, then they push our translations, they push our media accessibility into a more kind of creative direction, which is very exciting. And that's where we are. I don't know if there's any questions. Are there any questions there, Lidia, to take?
No, we just have, well, two expressions of admirations about the figures that you gave.
The 0.01, right? I guess.
0. No, it was, I think, at the beginning, and then our colleague Hannah, well, she's just saying that it wasn't a walking stick but a white cane.
Yes, yes, you're right.
Yeah, and then
walking stick. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Ruth, would you like to come in?
I'm reading Ruth's comment on the bottom of text with my pages.
Go ahead, Ruth.
Yes, go for it.
Well, I'd just be reading out what I'd said, really. I was just wondering for deaf people whether they accommodate and don't. You can read my question. It's a genuine question. I don't know whether that's an advantage or a multiple disadvantage.
Well, there's a lot of things there, Ruth. There's a book that we wrote on this, which is called The Reception of Subtitles for the Deaf in Europe, where we tested how this was received by deaf, hard of hearing, and hearing people. And the interesting thing about it was it depends on whether we're talking about hard of hearing people or sign language deaf users whose first language may be sign language, and they may be reading subtitles in their second language. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if we're users who are not deaf, normally we look at the subtitles very quickly, straight away. We read them as fast as we can, and then we go up into the image and we scan the image. But we never know how long the image is going to be there for. So we are in a bit of a hurry. We don't explore too much. Any elements on the periphery of the screen may not be seen by those who are watching the subtitles, the film with subtitles. Now, for deaf people, and I'm talking here now, sign language deaf speakers, they look at the subtitles straight away because they rely on them. They read them, and they may take longer for them to read them than for hearing people because it's their second language. So they have less time to look at the images. But what we have found is that the visual comprehension that they have is as good, if not better, than ours, despite the fact that they look at the image for shorter time, because they are very adept at obtaining information from the visuals. So that's taken us into a territory of creative media access where we think, when we subtitle for deaf people and we describe the sounds, can we not provide something more visual if visuals is what they are really good at taking information from? So that's kind of, there are different patterns. I'm just kind of summarizing a little bit, if you like. Does that answer your question in a way?
Yeah, thank
Yes.
you. Thank
Thanks.
you. I hadn't thought about sign language as a first language. Thank you.
Who's this, sorry?
I said I hadn't thought about sign language as a first language. I hadn't really thought about that.
So that's taken us into creative media accessibility, which, well, doesn't exist as a term in Google for some reason. We're beginning to publish a little bit about it, but it exists as a reality. There are little pockets of artists who are, whether or not they are disabled, whether or not they may be deaf or blind, they're interested in exploring the creative side of media access, which would be, okay, so those practices that do not only attempt to provide access for the users of a film or a play, but they seek to become an artistic contribution in their own right, you know. So we're looking into media accessibility as an artistic contribution or an extension of the artistic vision in the film. We have worked a lot with these filmmakers who made the documentary, brilliant documentary, Notes on Blindness. We experimented with them a lot as well. They're very keen on using access. This was a documentary, there's a BAFTA finalist, I think, on blindness, a brilliant film. I'll show you a few examples. We could maybe classify them in two poles or a spectrum, a continuum between what's inconspicuous and conspicuous, so more or less discrete, if you like. And here are some examples. For example, this is a filmmaker who has recently contacted us to make a film here in Galicia about an island and the people living in that island. And he says, I want to explore the different types of subtitles that I can use, not just go by the standard. So we gave him a portfolio with the typographic identity of the subtitling in the filming with different options for him to choose. So different fonts, different colors, different shadows, different backgrounds, different positions of the subtitles, different effects, and then they can choose. He's gone for the, I've got invisible here, well, inconspicuous, I guess. So do you want, every font will have a meaning as well. You know, there's something called font psychology. You may be very aware of this. So what does every font convey to the viewer? Do we want a square font, a rounder font? Do you want a wide or a narrow one? You know, do we want the subtitle to be below her? Do we want the subtitle to be close to where he's speaking, or at the bottom but on the side because it's in keeping with where he's looking? You know, if there's more speaking space on this side of the frame, is that where the subtitle should be? Or are we forcing people to look down here because every subtitle should be there, you know? I'll show you more examples later. There's plenty of them. In the film that I'm making with Ian Gibson, for example, we were exploring this as well. And we thought, well, you know, I know that I don't want my subtitle here because the eye tracking research that we've shown shows that this is not a place where viewers would be looking necessarily, and the journey from here to here, from up down, it's quite long and they miss little bits about the image. So I framed this. We knew that we wanted the books here and we knew that we wanted the subtitle here. So in a way, this had to be done in production, but it could have been done later maybe. And then what we did is we used a little box with the dominant color of the scene. See, if I've quite a lot of brown here, then that's kind of the background color that we wanted for the subtitle to make it more legible. Legibility is always obviously a priority, and then there are other considerations. Now I'm going to show you something completely different. In a film called Tiempo de Blues, there's a scene where the bad guy is kind of serving this drink to this girl, and the film was audio described for blind people. And for those of you who may not know about audio description, you have a running commentary describing the actions and the images in between the dialogue. This is how it happens. So normally you would have a voice more or less objectively saying, and Gerardo, if that's the name of the guy, approaches the girl and serves a drink, for example, right? Now, the interesting thing about this is that sometimes that voice takes you out of it, out of the story. It's a bit, you know, it doesn't promote, it doesn't push, it doesn't help to get engaged with the film when you have an external voice. So what this director did is he was very aware of this. He was working with blind people, and in consultation with them, he made this bad guy, you know, the bad character, he made him wear a key ring that makes noise. So since the very first moment in which that's identified as something that he's wearing, then every time that he's approaching somebody in the scene, you no longer have to introduce him, because you can hear his key ring, and the blind users who are watching the film, the blind spectators, they will, I immediately know that that's him coming up. Something that, by the way, is a trick that is of no importance and doesn't bother the rest of the viewers. So in a way, in a very invisible manner, you are providing a little clue that makes the film accessible to all. A very inclusive way of working, for example. What else? We have an example of more creative subtitles, for example, being used by the BBC Newsnight, one of the programs that they had on Brexit.
The British people have spoken. No constitutional changes are for keeps. Voters are fickle. Opinions change. We have no right to condemn future generations to abide irrevocably by the transient whims of the present. If ever a decision needed at least a 2/3 majority, it was Brexit. Brexit is permanent. It has huge ramifications, complex consequences. The costs and benefits, whatever they may be, and you need a PhD vote after a coup dictum, will resonate down the decades. So, did Cameron demand a 2/3 majority, or set a timetable for a second vote after a cooling off period?
So you may have seen there, obviously here we're way into the conspicuous, very visible, not discreet at all, attention drawing type of subtitles. It's another way of using creative media access to draw attention to it, to provide extra meaning. Yeah, obviously there's another way, and a lot of people are beginning to test the limits of where we can go with this in terms of creativity. So that's an example. And then there are people who are going even further, because in the case of Godard, for example, when he made his film Socialism, he took an interesting take. He said, well, I'm going to provide subtitles that are called, I mean, they're author subtitles, right? So he was in charge of them, and he called them Navajo subtitles. And he said, well, I am in the same way that the Indians, Native Indians in Western films, American classic Western films, were made to speak in one-syllable words and were portrayed as more simple, I think he mentioned, then this is what I'm going to do with my film. So for whoever is watching the film not in the original language, which was French plus other languages, whoever is watching the film with English subtitles, it's only going to get a few words here and there. So in this shot, you get somebody who's speaking quite a lot and mentioning German, Jew, and black amongst other words, but you only get those words. Or you get a compound of 2 words instead of a sentence. So you are having to make do with that. That's your only way into the film. And you know, you start thinking, obviously there's a reason why he's doing this, to disrupt in many ways. And there were very strong reactions. We can talk about them later by UK reviewers when they watched this film. They were very annoyed, but he was saying, well, you know, welcome to a world where in many other festivals, non-English speaking critics are made to watch the film with English subtitles, and they may not be able to follow. So obviously Godard was being playful with all this, but we could take this further and really question whether even the subtitles are meant to always provide you a faithful account of the dialogue. Maybe it's not a faithful, and maybe it's not even an account of the dialogue. And this is taking us into a territory that is not only creative media access, but it's maybe artistic media access. So media access or accessibility as the very point of the creation. And here I'd like to show you examples of some disability artists. Some of them are disabled, some of them are not, but they all deal with this. And this is an artist I'm working with lately. I've been working with Lisa Silvestre, and what she said was, when she was a child, out of boredom, but also out of her desire to fit in and hide the fact that she didn't know what was going on, she was deaf, and she was trying to access films without captions. She started documenting what she could understand from the film, even though there were no captions and she couldn't hear. To anyone else in the class who were watching this, it looked like she was taking notes, which she was taking notes, but not notes on any information. She was making up stories about what she could understand. She says, I had an entire complete experience that was separate from any of my classmates' experiences. Now, she's created what she calls a caption series, which she exhibits in museums, and transforming her reactions into captions. So the point of this is that normally when we have a film and we have captions, I always think about films having, you know, as some scholars have said, vertical and horizontal dialogue. Horizontal dialogue is the dialogue between the characters. Vertical dialogue would be what is the filmmaker telling us as viewers. Now, as captioners, as subtitlers, we subtitle dialogue, so that's just horizontal dialogue. But sometimes with subtitles for the deaf, we have to describe the sounds. And when a sound comes between brackets, for example, thunder rumbling or something like that, that's me, the captioner, talking to the viewers. That's vertical dialogue, right? Now, as far as I mean, up until now, I've only thought about that, captions in which I communicate something to the viewers. The interesting thing about Lisa's work is that she uses captions as a viewer to talk to all of us. So what you get is you get scenes from her TV switching, channel switching, sometimes a cartoon, sometimes a film. You get those scenes and we hear the scenes, we hear the characters speaking, and we see captions, which are her way of, is basically her voice. So at the beginning, sometimes we can see, I mean, if you put together her captions, it's a beautiful tale of exclusion of her, of how she's excluded from the audio-based world that she's trying to access because there are no captions other than what she's telling us here. Sometimes her captions will tell us that happened fast. The little lady must live there, which means basically she's trying to guess from the images what is going on because she has no access to the audio. The sky still does not let me know what time of the day it is. So again, we may not be looking at the sky too much, but this is all she has to be able to tell what the time of the day is. Here, most of us will be looking here, right? Because the main character is on the phone, taking some notes. She is bringing up something that he's asked her to bring up. And while we all look here, we may be missing what's happening in the background. But Lisa is not missing it because she has no access to the audio. What she has is access to the visuals, which she scans a lot. And that's why she's able to look at things that we may not be able to look at the periphery of the shot that is normally missed by us. She says in this scene, I just realized that none of them are swaying. None of these people, who are on a train, by the way, are swaying with the movement of the train. Again, I don't know whether, I mean, I wouldn't have noticed that at all. And she says, I think IMDb should hire hard of hearing people to catch those trivia bloopers. Obviously, she's drawing attention to how much she can spot by not looking at the audio and how differently she's seeing this to maybe me in this case. And the interesting thing about this is that she starts describing images. She doesn't strive to describe the sounds that she can hear because she's hard of hearing. No, she just describes images in a way. When she says she smiles knowingly, her face is so pale that it glows. You know what? The content of this subtitle, I can think of it as probably what I would use as an audio description for blind people. So this is a deaf person who is conveying her experience of exclusion through subtitles and whose sentences could actually be used as audio for blind people to access the images, which tells us that when we caption for deaf people, we shouldn't maybe think so much about sound, but about how much they get from the images. In the same way that when we describe for blind people, yes, describing the images is important, but allowing them to listen to the audio and make up a lot from that is also very important. And we get to this, for me, very exciting idea of what if the description of that this deaf person is given us could be used as audio description? And what if this description of a sound that a blind person could give us could actually be used as captions for deaf people? Is creative media accessibility a meeting point of the experiences of blind and deaf people? More descriptions that she's given us of what she can see and not hear. Their homes have similar colors, dark grays and blues and hunter greens, with light sources breaking up the dark shapes. We see her through her furniture. which feels intimate. Now, the reason why I'm giving you this is because she's describing the images, and I was saying, well, it could do for an audio description of this film for blind people if you read it out as a narration. But look, which feels intimate. The interesting thing is that there's some subjectivity about what she's given us, which is maybe a good solution for this cold audio description that we sometimes have. And the point I'm making here is that, maybe I'm going too quickly, but the description that we use for audio description, the captions we use for deaf people are normally very by the book, very standard and a little bit cold. These examples of creative media accessibility gives us a warmer, more subjective, more engagement-based type of accessibility that I think has a lot of potential. She doesn't only describe images. She gives us information about the exclusion that she feels. She says it's impossible to read cartoon lips. And then she tells us more. Sometimes it occurs to me that people have entire relationships through their phone. I haven't been able to hear well enough to talk on one since high school. I sometimes feel entirely cut off from pop culture. I'm left wondering how to make connections when I don't share the same content. And that's a key element, you know. We were talking about, are we all watching the same film or not? She feels that she's not even watching the same film, that the content is not the same, that when you're excluded, right? And what she's given us here is captions that really are a window into her world. You may say, well, it's just very subjective, it's one person's view, but there's something interesting about how we're learning. These are more captions that she gives us. Social situations feel like nightmares. I grope along the edges of conversation. Smile too much, I waste too much time pretending. So perhaps my point here being that for a long time in our world of media access research, translation research, we've been focusing on what I showed you before, where most people are looking. And because most people are looking here, our subtitling rules are based on that. Our guidelines for Netflix, for the BBC are based on that. Put your subtitle here, make sure everyone looks, etc. And it works, but it's sometimes they're a little bit cold and very comprehension based. We haven't really focused on this, you know, who's looking here and why, you know, because for us in our experimental research, we call them outliers, you know, in experimental research, data that is different, that is problematic, that is not valid, that is excluded. In the end, we have to exclude it from our calculations. The point of creative media access is that, okay, now that we've come to have all that kind of quantitative experimental based research that has given us solid and scientifically based guidelines, can we combine this with the more qualitative, subjective, individual, idiosyncratic type of views? And creative media accessibility can take us there by giving us little windows into the experiences of different types of viewers. So coming to the end of the presentation, you know, we have talked about the progress between accessible filmmaking to creative media access. Accessible filmmakers have been a lot. There's loads of them, loads of people who have considered a translation. I mean, still a minority, but these are some of the ones who have considered translation, worked with translators. Some of them have done it only for deaf and blind people, so it's more in terms of accessibility per se. But there are more and more, and we are kind of desperate to raise awareness and see whether we can reach out to more film schools where they're interested in this idea. Like I said, the people on Notes on Blindness give us a very good notion of what it means. You know, you go beyond issues of comprehension and you get into viewpoint, ambiguity. Working in an accessible filmmaking way allows the accessible versions to be an extension of the wider creative approach of the film. You know, this is the idea that you're now kind of in control as a filmmaker of how the film is going to be received by different types of viewers, not just the original viewers. So that's it, really. We have a research center where we work on this, different projects and publications. There's a book I've written about this, and if you cannot be bothered, there's a guide, online guide in English, where you can access a summary of it with examples of some of the content that I've shown today. We're trying to put together with the BFI a training course on accessible filmmaking, hopefully with elements of creative media accessibility as well. And what else? And these are just some final thoughts, really. I think most directors are making films maybe with the original viewers in mind, but not so much with the audience of a translated or accessible versions. To me, I mean, I'm going to be a bit harsh here, but I think it's a bit of an abdication of responsibility, because then that means that in many ways a second-rate experience is provided for those viewers if me as a translator, I have to decide what to do regarding aspects that, you know, I could do with discussing this with the filmmaker, you know. For me, again, accessible filmmaking makes financial sense because you reach a wider audience. Common sense because, you know, these days you don't plan the I don't know, a toilet for disabled people. You don't plan it once you've done your building, you plan it before. So, you know, in the same way, you should integrate notions of translation and accessibility from the beginning. And I do think that this is not just a new form of translating and making things of making films accessible, but a new of making films, of considering the audio and the images and how they come together for different viewers. And of course, this leads to creative media access, because it's just time for that now. Now that we have our strong scientifically based guidelines, then let's experiment along with filmmakers, you know, in collaboration with them. So I think that's it, really. What time is it? It's 1:45, so hopefully that gives us a little bit of time.
Thank you very much for this brilliant talk, Pablo. I think Kish had a question. He has been raising his hand very patiently for the past few minutes. So Kish, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, thanks so much for that wonderful talk. I'm very much interested in the representation of blind people in film, as well as accessibility for blind people. And I was thinking about the scene you described with the bad guy who carries the keys, which makes the noise, so that he's identifiable for blind people, and that's fitted into the film as a Trojan horse. I was wondering if creative media access only takes place after a film has been written, and therefore it's up to the filmmaker to consider blind people and deaf people, or whether creative media access can take place even before the filmmaker has thought about the filmmaking process, and can be considered when you're writing a script, for example.
Absolutely.
And so the creative media access takes place before the filmmaker. A writer might consider, I'm not just writing for people who can see and hear, I'm writing for everybody, including blind people and deaf people. And do you know any of examples of films where that has happened, or is that a prospect that you consider in creative media access?
Okay, let's put there was so much. In reality, I've covered perhaps a bit too much, because one thing is accessible filmmaking, the other one is creative media access. But let's recap a little bit. Creative media access, understood as creative media access and creative translation, can take place during the making, including pre-production there, or a distribution stage. Now, at distribution stage, it happens. So that means no relationship with the filmmaker, no contact. But say, for example, some fans decide to audio describe the film by themselves, subtitle the films by themselves, all this phenomenon of fan sabbing, for example, and they go crazily creative with it. But that's just more of a, let's see what we can do with this. And the filmmaker is not aware of that. So that's one way of doing things. I'm not covering that because it's a whole world in itself. What I'm interested in normally is creative media access in collaboration with the filmmakers. And there, it could happen at pre-production, production, or post-production. So at pre-production, when we contacted the filmmakers who made Notes on Blindness, who are now making a film about Chaplin, we were contacted by them in pre-production. So we access the script and we start highlighting elements that we think, oh, you know, careful with this one, or shall we explore here? Shall we play with this? Absolutely. For one very simple reason, because the script itself, when it describes actions, it's part of it's in a way an audio description as well. Yeah. So it gives us a lot of ideas about how, you know, how everything may materialize into images. So we can play a lot with it from the beginning. What else? there's an element which is very simple. If you're thinking about deaf people and how, as a captioner, you have to describe music. If it's not a song, but just kind of instrumental music, you're often struggling in one day in your room to describe the feeling that that music is conveying, and you have to use an adjective for that. But you're thinking, why am I describing this music? And trying to find a word. If the music, which was created for the film, was once upon a time in pre-production described by the filmmaker to a musician turned the description into sound, can I not access that description already? You know what I mean? So if you get in pre-production, then everything becomes easier. You get to the very core of the intentions, the visions of the film by the filmmaker or whoever, and then you can play with it. So yes, more and more people are starting to work on this from the very pre-production process, with the script, with the what do you call it? The when you get the pictures of the shots, what do you call it in English? I can't remember the pictures with the different shots, right? The storybook or whatever you want to call it, because that gives us, sorry?
Storyboard.
The storyboard, because obviously if I see the storyboard, I can say, oh, look, you know, the only way for me to subtitle that scene is to put the subtitle over Keisha's mouth, because you have a tight close-up. That means whoever's going to lip read the film is not going to be able to do it. You know, all these things are very useful. So yeah, to answer your question, as long as we are possible, as it's possible, we start from pre-production, definitely. Then again, Kish, there's another thing, which is in most examples of artistic media access, it's the creator, him or herself, who's thinking about it from the beginning. So, you know, from their point of view, because access is the main point of the work of art, then of course they work from the beginning. So with Lisa Silvestre now, we're looking at this meeting point between blindness and deafness, as I try to explain, and that's the, they call it the generative value of media access. That is, what can we create through media access? But of course, it can only be done through pre-production. Yeah, whenever, the sooner the better. Yeah. Shall I read? Kish,
Yes,
did I answer your question?
Well, I think Hannah has two questions. One is about your film. Well, perhaps Hannah, would you like to come in?
I'm reading it here. The documentary, did it include creative audio description? I wish I had. No, this was done in 2012. What I did is I created just audio description for it. And I created kind of, a friend of mine, a colleague, created creative subtitles for it. But no, I have normal audio description for the film, normal subtitles, and slightly more creative subtitles. I am going to look at what you're sending me as well. You say that you've discussed creative audio description and the depictions of blindness there. Brilliant. I'll be very keen to have a look at that.
There's a couple of things, films that are about blind people. Well, there's this whole issue about, if you've got a film which has got a blind character in it, how does the blind character in the film relate to the sighted characters in the film? And integrated or creative audio description can be a way of making that happen for the, like, internally and externally. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts on the article that I wrote.
Yeah, I've just read the abstract and it looks fascinating, Hannah. Yeah. I will, if I can get your contact, I will, absolutely. Remember that when it comes to theatre, a lot of the audio description that's being done these days is completely integrated, which means that we're talking about a narration that goes out to everyone and that provides access to blind people and visually impaired people, and at the same time, you know, it's there for everyone. So it's what we can call all for all kind of thing, as in, you know, there are even films that are experimenting with subtitles and audio description at the same time, and it provides a wonderfully crazy experience because you get everything there. And in a way, it's saying, well, I am actually considering every audience, and I'm not even sure I want to give the same to every audience. You know what I mean? Why not play around with that too? Because we tend to say, okay, so for blind people, we're going to describe this very clearly, but why not making it complex for them as well and leave some gaps in the same way that there are gaps for everyone else too? So it's just a whole world that needs to be experimented with at the moment. So the film is in Vimeo, yes. Hannah, you said the point about the crossover between deaf and blind access is fascinating. I'll get back to you on this one, Hannah, yeah? as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I work on. I work mostly on audio description, and it's often the case that people think that access for different groups goes in different directions.
Yeah, but you see,
actually, I think creative crossovers is a really it's got a lot of potential.
Yeah, because when I was reading those captions, I was thinking, doesn't it sound like an audio description, you know? But a warm one, you know, with a feel for the individual. Think about it. When you talk about narrations, you have your, I mean, you guys will know all about it, but unreliable narrators and things like that, you know. But none of that has been. A lot of that needs to be experimented with in terms of audio description. Why should I trust my audio describer? You know what I mean? So there's a lot. In terms of the crossover, can screen readers access subtitles on film? In fact, do you have any tips for us? Do you think I'm right? As students can read text with accommodation? Ruth, could you elaborate a little bit so that I know exactly?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not the most technical person.
No problem.
I was just kind of the crossover that you and Hannah were just discussing there about, you know, how if I'm watching a film on my laptop, can I use a screen reader as a blind
okay.
A blind person? Can I use it to access the subtitles? There's a creative crossover there, isn't there, potentially? Or if I'm just prepared. And then that made me think, of the challenges. Well, not the challenges, but made me think about some of the frustrating things about accessibility for our blind and visually impaired students at the moment. That we, you know, when we're doing what you're doing right now, which is giving a presentation on Teams, the screen reader can't operate, and they have to download a PowerPoint and have a look at all the bit, you know, the descriptions of the stills, let alone footage. So, I mean, since you're in the profession, how do you overcome that? So when you're, you know, giving a presentation like today, there's so many layers, aren't there, and sort of potential ironies bound up with it. What do we do?
It's a nightmare. It is an absolute nightmare. Normally, I ask. Because, you know, we've been working on this idea of media for all. Even our conferences and books are called like that, you know, but it's all a lie, really. I mean, it's just that we're content thinking that because we have audio description and subtitles, we're catering for everyone, but we're really not. And I think all you can do at the moment is just ask if you're going to have any blind, deaf people in the audience, and then adapt for it. When we have had to do that for training material, for example, in our, I don't know if I can write in the chat, I think it's ILSA project on live subtitling, we've had a few consultants who were deaf and blind, and then all our materials were painstakingly taken through their filters and got back to us saying, okay, you need to provide this and that and that and that to make sure that it's all accessible in both ways. And that included screen readers being able to read everything, PowerPoints that were not in PDF because PDF was problematic, but in another format. So I'm not even an expert on that. I normally ask experts, and then we accommodate for all that. I'm not giving you a straight answer because I don't have it. What I mean is, even if you've been working in the field for 10 years, you still need to test everything and say, okay, what do I need to make it accessible to you? So I need actually blind consultants and deaf consultants. Is the only way. It's very difficult, and it takes us to one more element that I forgot to mention, which is until now we've been content to talk about simple access, which was okay, a ramp. My film will have a ramp for you to access it, right? But that's no longer enough. I mean, we're now moving into inclusion and participation, which is completely different now. Somebody told me the other day, access is being able to enter the room. Inclusion is sitting at the table, participation is eating the meal with the rest of them. And basically what that means is that one thing is access to content. So we made the ramp, but we've been making the same ramp for every film. You follow the guidelines, that's it. The films are completely different, but the access is always the same. Something is very wrong with that, in my opinion. Accessible filmmaking allows you to adapt the ramp to every film. So the ramp goes well with the film, but it's still not where we should go, because that's still me hearing and sighted telling you a story, and I give you access to it. Very nice access, but access to it. So the next step would be I don't know, whoever may be deaf, blind, or any other kind of aspect along the range of diversity that can tell the story so that we can access to it. So that's where we're going with creative media access, I think. So it's the transition between accessibility to inclusion and participation that is giving all that. And as we move forward, we see how much is falling by the wayside, you know. And part of what's falling by the wayside is in education, as you were saying. So there's so much work to be done. So the fact that we're going creative doesn't mean that we've ticked all the boxes at all.
We have a last question from Romy Martinez. Would you like to come in, Romy?
Yeah.
Hi, hello. So as I mentioned, I'm not from I'm from a different subject, but as I mentioned on my comment, just if you could provide ideas on how I could make this subtitles, which are the translations of the songs I'm working in, more accessible. That's the reason that I came into the session. Actually, I found your research very important as well in music, and musicians who are working with exploring languages. In this case, is particularly indigenous, and we're trying to bring it into English so that people can learn from them as well. So.
That's fascinating, Romy. A lot of creative media access is going on with music at the moment. A lot of it with sign language. There are many musicians who are now kind of translating their songs into sign language with a signer that is sitting beside them, or that is part of a mise-en-scene. And in terms of subtitles, I think creative subtitles are very kind of apt, very appropriate for music as well. So there's a lot of things that you can do to make them more appealing, and also in a way, it's not just more appealing, but to ensure that the subtitles are integrated and they are in keeping with the aesthetics of the video that you're making. So do send me an email. I'm gonna send you my email address. Do send me an email, and I'll look for examples if you like.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Where can I find your email, just to make sure that
I'll put it on the chat, yeah, if that's okay. Can anybody, I mean, it's a strange request, but can anybody write an ad? Because I don't seem to be able to type it, and I copy and paste it.
Don't worry, I can copy paste it in the chat, Pablo.
Oh, I've got it there. Yeah, I've got it. Thank you.
Did you manage?
Yeah, there you go. That's the one. That's mine.
So thank you very much for this.
Very welcome.
Very exciting presentation, which I think is very has been brilliant. And that's it. Thank you very much as well for attending, you all. I hope you have food for thought, and you'll see that that will be back with more events at the Center for Visual Cultures very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. That was brilliant.
Thank you, Kish. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ruth. And Ruth and Katie. Pleasure. Take care, yeah? Thank you, Lidia, for inviting me.